America used to be Africa's top trading partner. Today, that distinction goes to China. Just recently, the Chinese president promised a whopping $60 billion in development financing. And it's not just China. Europe, India, Turkey, Japan, they're all part of the new scramble for Africa. As the U.S. follows an agenda of America first, perhaps Africa will respond with its own agenda of Africa first. Hello, I'm Carol Pineau. Welcome to our special series, Africa and the Trump Administration. In the post-colonial world, the U.S. played a major role in Africa. The U.S. was Africa's top trading partner. It dominated development financing. And along with Europe, America shaped Africa's geopolitical landscape. We'll be looking at all this and more with our guests. But first, we start with the elephant in the living room, China. In 2009, the power balance in Africa shifted. Chinese trade and investment, which had grown for a decade at a staggering pace, finally surpassed the U.S. Meanwhile, America looked on disapprovingly, tisk-tisking that the Chinese didn't demand good governance in return for investment. But the Chinese understood this was about competition, particularly competition for Africa's vast natural resources and potential markets. As Chinese trade and investment continues to far eclipse the U.S., and as the White House pursues a foreign policy of America first, perhaps it's time to ask, for Africa, is America still relevant today? We have a great panel with us today. We have Dr. Vera Songwe, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. We have Whitney Schneidman, who is the senior international advisor for Africa at Covington Burling and was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. And we have John Gizzi, who is the chief political reporter for Newsmax Media and a White House reporter. Thank you so much for being here, everyone. Vera, if I can start with you. Thinking of Chinese investment, how much has that really affected the relationship and the power dynamics in Africa?
I think the Chinese have been a little bit more aggressive because they've come early, they've stayed, and I think there is a bigger push for having Chinese factories when we look at places like Ethiopia, where they have shoe factories and textile factories, and they have now done a high-speed train. So I think those investments are visible and concrete. I think there are also Western investments that are as important because they are value-adding. When you export to America, the value add of that export is quite high. When you export to China, the value add is less, but you're still creating jobs. At this point in time, what we want to do is get investment that does a little bit of both as we all move, because eventually we all want to move up to the value-adding content of our exports. And I think clearly most efficient firms come from the United States, so they will always get first bet and first chance if they come in. My sense is that there is healthy competition now.
Whitney, I know that there's several times when I've called over to your office and you have been in China and Asia, you're all over the place. So in deal making, clearly when you're making deals for Africa, it's pretty much everywhere, isn't it?
Well, it is. And it's a mistake to see the competition between U.S. and China in Africa as a zero-sum proposition. Because Africa, number one, is so large with 54 countries. It's a vast continent that there's tremendous opportunity and there's tremendous needs. So much attention is being given to infrastructure today. How do we get more roads? How do we get more airports? How do we get more ports? And this is where China has played a very important role, and I think we're looking to get U.S. companies more involved. So really the interesting conversation is how do we get more cooperation among stakeholders who are on the outside, who are friends of Africa, want to work with Africa, and how do we get more regional integration within Africa so that there's more commerce, there's more trading among businesses on the continent. Initially, my view was that we have to keep an open mind. Remembering that when President Clinton came in, he had very little experience with Africa. He got the landmark African Growth and Opportunity Act passed through Congress. When President Bush came in, he got PEPFAR. He had no experience, but he got this life-saving legislation that really helped to respond to the HIV/AIDS crisis. Certainly, President Obama put in place a number of very important initiatives. So the message there is to keep an open mind about President Trump. However, when you put a budget forward that threatens to zero out development assistance, that sort of threatens to undermine a lot of what has been achieved on a bipartisan basis. So the challenge to the Trump administration is how do you get the right balance between hard power to go to the security side and soft power, which deals with very fundamental issues related to economic development.
I agree with you. The budget that was put forward is a draft of a budget, and it by no means is going to be what comes down when the administration looks at everything that's on the table. That's coming. I will say one thing. The president himself gave a strong signal that he was not going to move on cutting back U.S. assistance to the International Monetary Fund, and that we would still play a role. So you do have a president who at least understands the global economy and the role the U.S. must play.
Right, but when you say I want to close 40 out of 100 USAID missions, the response from the supporters is not keep all 40 open. It's like, okay, only cut 20 or only cut 10. So by definition, you're, in my view, weakening our capability to impact positively on the continent.
China is not the only economic change in Africa. Until recently, major financing for development came from USAID and multilateral agencies. These funds often came with major strings attached, and African governments had little choice but to agree. Today, financing is far more varied. There are public-private partnerships, sovereign wealth funds, stock markets that raise capital for businesses, private equity funds, and so much more. Unlike USAID or multilaterals, where the U.S. holds the largest voting share, these new funding vehicles have few, if any, strings attached, and the U.S. has little or no influence. Again, Africa has choices, but have these options diminished America's relevance? So again, Vera, if I can come to you with this, one of the questions with this is, were those strings helpful? And are we actually now in a situation where these funding vehicles, where there is easier money without strings attached, are making it so governments don't have to do things that they might have had to have done otherwise that would be beneficial? Certainly there were things that weren't beneficial, but there were things that were beneficial.
I don't know if I would say that there is easier money. I think that I would say that the return on the continent is higher. And when you're in a situation where you have negative interest rates in most other parts of the world, people, naturally as capitalists look for where they will get a better return. And, you have the African continent today that offers that kind of return. But I think that because it is hard-earned resources, you don't find a U.S. investor or a Chinese investor or a Turkish investor just going to invest in any road or any energy plant on the continent. They still look for one that is well run. And to get a plant that's well run, you need a government that has an institution that can run it well. So my sense is that even though the strings may not be visible in the sense of saying you do this and you don't get this, the strings are still there because it says if you have a good energy utility, I'll invest. If you don't have a good energy utility, so the string has become the capital. But this time around, it's made by market players that can leverage, again, what is happening. And so I think what we are doing is saying, and the African countries are understanding that, and I think it's actually a little bit more transparent in some sense, because capital is going where regulation is happening faster, where governance is more solid and developing, where there are institutions, where education is better. And I think it's a direct result. And I think actually what you see, and maybe this is the positive of the what is happening today, is capital is voting for the right institutions.
John, are you at all concerned that as USAID budgets are cut and other State Department budgets are cut, that there's going to be less influence, that America will lose some of its relevance?
I do understand the concern of others on that. It simply makes sense on paper that when you do cut a budget for an organization that delves in the international area, you are bound to lose influence. I would submit to you that Africa has a more business-friendly climate than it has, and people in the private sector are playing a greater role. If you look at Algeria or Morocco or even Egypt, whatever their problems on the political front, on the financial front, there is the opportunity for growth, and private business is investing.
But it's hard to see where that's coming from. I mean, I agree with you. I would very much like to see this administration get behind a strong private sector push to Africa. But when the budget comes forward and, for example, they're going to zero out the trade and investment hubs that we have in sub-Saharan Africa that work with U.S. companies, that leaves American companies on their own. And American companies do not understand the African market. They're just sort of waking up to the African market and learning how to navigate it. It's these signals that this administration has to get right. It has to get the balance between hard and soft power, and it has to do the diplomatic work of showing to Africa that it's a priority for the United States, just like the three previous administrations have done.
And all of them started off in a very slippery slope when it came to Africa. Even the first president to be a first-generation African-American president, and yet they grew as they became more interested and more involved. President Obama really hit his stride on Africa only in his second term.
Right.
The trip to South Africa and the formation of the Young Leaders Group. Would you give this new administration some time?
I would, but they've already showed their hand, as we've said, sort of taking off the table tools that they're going to need to build on. Now, they may surprise us all. I think for instance, President Trump's CEO Forum, that has 20 CEOs on it. Mm-hmm. Half of those CEOs represent companies that are active in Africa. That could be a great forum to focus on Africa, to have an Africa subgroup with those CEOs. That'd be a very creative initiative. However, it still need to be staffed by the U.S. government. It would need direction. If there's that creative thinking, that could be quite helpful.
Well,
do you see this as being an important part here?
I think so. I think that clearly when you have that many companies, and many of them, I will submit, are making a big part of their profits off of trade with the continent. Mm-hmm. So I think they know how to do it. They can explain what different changes and different policies will do. And my hope is that some of these policies will not see the light of day, because the companies and the businesses will be able to argue for a better engagement and a stronger engagement with the continent. Many of them have been in the continent for a very long time, and I think can testify to the progress that has been made, both in terms of doing business, in terms of improving the business environment, and in terms of how easy it is to sort of establish that trade that is happening. And today we talk about global value chains. Many of them have businesses across continents, not just in the US or in Africa, but going through Asia and back into Africa, and the trade finally ends up in the US. So I think we'll also begin to see that it's not so easy to sort of stop one node and let the other node continue. We are really today a global world.
The balance of power with Africa has clearly changed, and it's not just economics. Africa is recognizing its own power. The African Development Bank and African Union have become vibrant organizations. Regional trade blocs are stronger, and governments are increasingly articulating their own visions for the future. Does that mean that America has lost its relevance, or is this simply a realignment of the relationship? So, Whitney, you have worked on the relationship of U.S. and Africa for a very long time. Do you see a realignment happening?
Very much so. I mean, I think John was referring to it, what might be called the brain gain. There's a whole generation of leaders, of young African men and women who maybe have been educated in the West, worked in investment banks, worked in the World Bank, worked a number of places, who've returned back to the continent because there's opportunities for them and there's a need. You've got companies that they join, GE, others. And so I think that's a really important driving force. One thing that I think is enduring, however, is this desire for democratic government. And I think that's really the currency between the U.S. and the continent. People want representative governments. They want to see economic progress. They want to feel that their energies, properly invested, generate proper returns. And I think that's a very important dynamic that augurs well for future progress on the continent.
John, I saw you shaking your head vigorously throughout that.
I'm shaking my head in agreement. Since 2001, 16 of the reigning leaders of African countries tried to change their constitutions in order to perpetuate their reign in office. This is something that has not deterred the Chinese from investing at all, but Americans still like to try to influence them toward a more democratic side.
Vera, I actually want to ask you something different about the institutions in Africa.
In general, and Whitney mentioned that, there was a brain drain, and now there is a return, and I think what we can call a brain gain. Again, this is happening in countries where you see institutions opening up a little bit, and I think when you look at countries like Ghana, countries like Senegal, what you begin to see is leaders taking over, bringing in, I mean, the Minister of Finance of Ghana today comes from the private sector, has experience, international experience, can actually formulate his own strategy.
Considerable economic experience.
Exactly,
Yeah.
knows what he wants, knows where he's going. And my sense is, as we talk about, when we use terms like democracy, it's not only democratizing government, it's democratizing the economics and democratizing the social sphere. And I think that's opening up. It used to be that in many of these countries, you know, we had 6 or 7 people that control the economic power in those countries, and now you have new businesses coming up, small, medium, and large enterprises. And I think that is really the focus. The focus today on the continent is saying, how can we open up? How can we democratize? I think we talked a lot about, you know, in the early 20s, you know, we had growth without equity. And this is an issue that I want to sort of, we're struggling with it, including in the United States, is to say, how can you make sure that you get growth and you get equity? We see what happens when, you know, you have growth without equity. It leads into issues of security. And I think there's a lot more of that kind of thought on the continent, which goes back to your question where we now answer questions of growth differently. You know, yes, we want to grow, but what kind of growth do we want to have?
In this globalized world, is it normal that Africa would look more to itself and look less to America? That is the reason for a diminishing relevance, if you will.
I don't know that we have established a case for diminishing relevance. I think that what I will call it is shifting relevance, shifting spheres of relevance. I think that clearly on the security front, you know, we are all in this game together, you know, and you know, what happens in Syria will eventually, you know, affect northern Nigeria, will eventually affect southern Sudan and Eritrea. So I think there is, you know, we're all, and I think one of the terms that was very wisely coined during the financial crisis was too big to fail. There is no too small to fail. We have to make sure that even the small of the smallest are engaged and relevant in this world today, because the ISIS community is probably the smallest state that exists, but they are a threat to the global world and threatening then our economic and our social stability. So my sense is that is what we have to look at. On the economic front, I think that, as we have rightly said, we do now have a cadre of Africans that can think about their future, their aspirations, and can actually affect it. We do have a number of African businessmen that are actually, you know, charging ahead and leading the forefront. We just did a study that showed that the 500 African businesses that have been on the continent and making the best returns on their investments today, because they know the environment and they are the ones who are going to leverage others to come in. So of course they've taken that space, which, you know, hitherto was not available to them. So you know, in the security space, we're all going to remain relevant. In the economic space, of course, African businesses, it is their backyard. They're going to have some advantages. But I think as they get more advantages, they're creating more for others. And again, it's this issue of leveraging. You know, they're taking more space, but they still need capital. There is capital in the West that is idle or that is not getting enough of a return, so that capital becomes more relevant on the continent.
We'll take some questions from our viewers, starting with Patrick of Fredericksburg, Virginia. For Africa, do you think America First is just a slogan, or do you think it will really affect us? Will life in Africa change with this administration? So, John, I'm going to give that to you, since you have talked to the people who are in charge of these things.
I think America First essentially refers to the United States getting its economic house in order and improving the engine of plenty here. But it certainly doesn't mean cutting oneself off from the rest of the world. No successful entrepreneur denies there is a global economy.
If this administration can really get together a policy that focuses on promoting U.S. investment, focusing not only on infrastructure in the United States, but infrastructure in Africa, then you'll see U.S. exports to the continent increase. Currently, we export about $20 billion worth of products to the continent, which supports 120,000 jobs. If we can really sort of double that over the next 4 years, that would have a profound impact on African infrastructure, but it would also be incredibly beneficial to the United
Great
States
job,
as
Sarah.
well.
Countries like Cote d'Ivoire, countries like Ghana, countries like Cameroon, countries like Nigeria, 75% of the world's cocoa production is in those 4 countries. What they do is essentially exported to the developing world, including to the United States, for it to be processed as Mars chocolate and other Nestle foods. And so I think what you begin to see is if you say, well, only jobs in the United States, and the African governments or Ghana or Nigeria says only jobs in Nigeria, then the cocoa doesn't get out and the chocolate doesn't get made. But we need to trade because we need to be able to buy each other's goods as well. So I think those kinds of discussions will quickly end up in, again, a global discussion. We've just seen, I think, that the discussion, and one of the things that gives me comfort is also that on the continent, we now have regional trade blocs. In West Africa, we have ECOWAS, 300 million people. In East Africa, we're getting to 600 million people. And that trade is happening amongst the continent. And we're creating big markets and big masses where I think in some sense, what we were just talking about is 120,000 jobs created here can very quickly get to 360 if you make those jobs more efficiently, so that at the end of the day, we need incomes to go up, we need prosperity to increase so that they can demand more. And if you get that dynamic going, and I think that's really what we all want, is if you create that dynamic, you increase that efficiency, you will get more jobs being created, more markets, more opportunity. The one thing that we must always remember is that there is still a huge opportunity for opening markets, for creating markets on the continent.
All right, that brings us to the end of our program. Thank you so much to my guests, John Gizzi, Whitney Schneidman, and Vera Songwe.